develop language varieties. So let's talk about the standard language. This is what we often think of as an idealized form of speech. It usually exists for most people as the version of the language that is officially accepted in their community or country. It's kind of like the official way of speaking that you might hear in formal settings. Now, an interesting point is that this standard language isn't tied to a specific region. Unlike dialects that are associated with particular areas, the standard language is linked more to certain institutions. It's the variety you hear in administrative offices, in the media, in schools, and in other educational or commercial centers. So, regardless of where someone is from within a country, the standard language serves as a kind of shared, formal version of the language used across the nation. This helps us understand how language functions not just as a means of communication, but also as a tool for social cohesion and official identity. Today, I want to talk about the variety of English that we teach to those who are eager to learn it as a foreign or second language. This is the version of English you'll find everywhere, in TV shows, newspapers, books, and even in schools around the world. It's what we often refer to as the standard form of the language. There are several well-known standards, such as Standard American English, Standard British English, Standard Australian English, and Standard Canadian English. Each of these has its own unique features, but they all share the common goal of providing a clear and communicative form of English that people can understand globally. This standard language is really the foundation of effective communication, especially in international contexts. It's what learners aim for to ensure they can be understood no matter where they are. As we continue, we'll see how these standards influence teaching and learning, helping students connect with the wider world through their language skills. So, when we talk about aspects of the pronunciation of a language that can reveal where someone is from, either regionally or socially, we call that an accent. It's a common misconception that some people speak without an accent at all, but that's actually a myth. Every language user has an accent. The differences might be more obvious in some cases and more subtle in others, but no one is truly without one. Now, moving on to dialects, these are a bit broader. They include not only pronunciation differences, but also variations in grammar and vocabulary among speakers within a social group. These differences create what we call a dialect, which is essentially a variety of a language. So, to connect these ideas, both accent and dialect help us understand the rich diversity within a language. They show us how language varies depending on where you're from or who you are, which ties into the overall theme of language as a dynamic, living form of communication. So, when we talk about dialectology, we're really diving into the study of dialects, which helps us understand how to distinguish between two different dialects of the same language, as well as between entirely different languages. Now, from a linguistic perspective, it's important to remember that no dialect is inherently better than another. They are simply different ways of speaking within a language. But socially, things can be quite different. One dialect might carry more prestige, often linked to social or political power. For example, the standard dialects are usually connected to cultural or political centers, which can influence perceptions and attitudes towards different dialects. This distinction is crucial because it highlights how language is not just about communication, but also about identity and power dynamics. Connecting this to the broader theme of our presentation, understanding dialectology allows us to appreciate the rich diversity of language while recognizing the social factors that shape language use and perception. A lot of research has been done on different dialects, and when conducting these studies, researchers often selected specific groups called NORMS. These NORMS were typically non-mobile, older, rural male speakers. The idea was that these individuals were less likely to have been influenced by outside regions or new linguistic trends, so their speech provides a more pure example of local dialects. One important consequence of using such criteria is that the dialect descriptions we get tend to reflect a period well before the time of the study. In other words, these speakers' speech patterns often preserve older linguistic features. Despite that, the detailed information obtained from these studies has been invaluable. It has laid the foundation for creating comprehensive linguistic atlases, not just for one country like England, but for entire regions, such as the Upper Midwest in the United States. So, in essence, these carefully selected speakers help us understand the historical and regional variations in speech, which ties into the broader theme of how dialects evolve and are preserved over time. So, on this slide, we're looking at a line on a linguistic map called an isogloss. An isogloss marks a boundary between areas that differ in regard to a specific linguistic item. Essentially, it shows where a particular word, pronunciation, or grammatical feature changes. When several of these isoglosses come together and form a thicker line, that indicates a dialect boundary. This is important because it helps us see how language varieties are organized geographically. Understanding these boundaries gives us insight into how dialects develop and how language varies across regions, which ties into the broader theme of how language evolves and spreads. Let's take a closer look at isoglosses and dialect boundaries. These are key concepts in understanding how different speech patterns and vocabulary vary across regions. An isogloss is essentially a boundary line that marks where a particular linguistic feature changes. For example, it could separate areas where people say soda versus pop. These lines help us visualize how language features spread or stay confined to specific areas. Now, dialect boundaries are often shaped by these isoglosses. They represent the geographical limits where particular dialects are spoken. Think of them as the borders between different speech communities. Recognizing these boundaries helps us see how language evolves and adapts based on social, historical, or geographical factors. Connecting this to our broader theme, understanding isoglosses and dialect boundaries sheds light on the dynamic nature of language. It shows us how regional identities and cultural influences shape the way we communicate. These boundaries are not just lines on a map. They tell stories about history, migration, and social interaction. So, if we find a very similar distribution for another pair of items, like preferring pail to the north and bucket to the south, then we can draw another isogloss on the map. This isogloss would probably overlap with the first one, showing how these linguistic features are connected geographically. When multiple isoglosses come together in this way, they form a more solid line. And this solid line actually indicates what we call a dialect boundary. It's essentially a boundary that separates different dialect regions, highlighting where linguistic differences are most pronounced. Understanding how these isoglosses and boundaries work helps us see how language varies across regions and how different dialects develop and stay distinct over space. So, using this dialect boundary information, researchers have identified a distinct northern dialect area in the upper Midwest of the USA. This is quite fascinating because it shows how language varies across regions. In this northern area, people tend to say words like paper bag, pail, kerosene, slippery, and get sick. These words reflect the regional speech patterns that are unique to that part of the country. In contrast, in the Midland region, people use different terms like paper sack, bucket, coal oil, slick, and take sick. These differences highlight how language boundaries, called isoglosses, mark the edges where dialects change. Understanding these dialect boundaries helps us see the broader picture of regional language variation. It shows how geography and community influence the way we speak, connecting to the overall theme of how dialects develop and stay distinct over distances. Now, at the dialect boundary areas, one dialect or language variety gradually merges into another. This is an important point because it shows that regional variation isn't always about clear-cut, sharp boundaries. Instead, we can think of it as existing along a dialect continuum, where neighboring regions have more similar speech, and the differences become more pronounced as you move further away. This idea helps us understand language variation as a spectrum rather than isolated pockets. It also explains how speakers who live near these boundaries often move back and forth across them with relative ease, switching between different varieties depending on the context. These speakers are often described as bidialectal, they can comfortably use more than one dialect or language variety. So, in the bigger picture, understanding the dialect continuum gives us a more nuanced view of regional language variation. It highlights how language is fluid and interconnected across regions, which is a key theme in understanding how dialects develop and change over time. In many countries, regional variation isn't just about different dialects of a single language. It can actually involve entirely distinct and separate languages. This means that what we might think of as regional differences can sometimes be quite profound, reflecting different linguistic identities. When this happens, bilingualism at the individual level usually becomes a feature of smaller, specific groups rather than the entire population. In these situations, a member of a minority group typically grows up speaking one language within their community, say, their local or indigenous language, while also learning another language to participate in the broader, more dominant society. This kind of bilingualism is quite common in areas with diverse linguistic landscapes. Now, connecting this to our overall theme, it's important to understand that bilingualism in such contexts often coexists with diglossia, where different languages or dialects serve different social functions. Recognizing these distinctions helps us appreciate the complex ways language shapes identity and social interaction across different regions. So, here we see a rather special situation that occurs in some countries, and it's called diglossia. Now, diglossia involves two distinct varieties of a language. The first is what we call the low variety. This is the version of the language that people acquire locally, usually from their families and communities, and they use it for everyday conversations, casual interactions, and informal settings. It's the language you hear when people are chatting in the market or at home. The second variety is the high variety. This one is quite different because it's learned in formal settings like schools and used for important matters. For example, in official speeches, literature, or formal writing, this high variety is the standard. Let me give you an example to clarify this concept: Arabic. In many Arabic-speaking countries, there's a clear distinction between the colloquial dialects, which are used daily, and modern Standard Arabic, which is taught in schools and used in media and official documents. This distinction illustrates how diglossia operates in real life. Understanding diglossia is important because it highlights how language functions differently depending on context, and it reminds us that language is deeply tied to social and cultural practices. It also shows us how formal and informal language use can coexist within a society, each serving its specific purpose. In Pakistan, Urdu was chosen as the national language, which is a key step in shaping national identity. But selecting a language is just the beginning. The process of selection is followed by codification, where linguists develop basic grammars, dictionaries, and written models to establish a standard variety that everyone can learn and use. Next comes elaboration, where this standard variety is expanded for use in all areas of social life, like education, media, and everyday communication, and a body of literary work is created in it, enriching its cultural presence. Then we have implementation, where the government actively promotes the use of this standard language through policies and initiatives. Finally, acceptance happens when a large majority of the population begins to use the language regularly and sees it as a core part of their national identity, both socially and culturally. This entire process illustrates how language planning is a strategic effort to shape national identity and unify diverse populations through a common language. So, a variety of languages have been developed throughout history primarily for practical purposes, like trade, especially among people who needed to communicate but didn't share the same native language. One interesting example of this is the concept of a pidgin. A pidgin is a simplified language that develops when speakers of different languages need to communicate, often for trade or commerce. When we talk about an English pidgin, we mean a pidgin that uses English as its lexifier language. That means English is the main source of the words in that pidgin, even though the overall structure might be simplified or altered. It's also important to note that pidgins have no native speakers. They are typically used as a second language by people who need to communicate across language barriers. And this idea of pidgins connects directly to the broader topic of creoles, which are more complex languages that develop from pidgins and become the mother tongue of a community. Understanding these language types helps us see how languages evolve and adapt to social needs, especially in multicultural and multilingual contexts. When a pidgin develops beyond its original purpose as a trade or contact language, and it starts being used as the first language of a community, we call that a creole. Essentially, a creole begins when children in a pidgin-using environment learn and adopt the language as their native tongue. Over time, it becomes more complex, expanding to serve a wider range of communicative needs within the community. A key point to remember is that the vocabulary elements from the original pidgin often become grammatical elements in the creole. So, what started as a simplified means of communication transforms into a fully developed language. For example, Tok Pisin in Papua New Guinea is a well-known creole language. It illustrates how a pidgin can evolve into a rich, fully functional language that plays a central role in daily life and culture. This process highlights the fascinating ways languages can develop and adapt, especially when they transition from contact languages to native languages, shaping the identity of entire communities. So, the development from a pidgin to a creole is called creolization. This is the process where a simplified language forms and then becomes a fully developed creole language. After this creolization happens, you often see a retreat or a pulling back from the use of the creole by those who have more contact with a standard or more prestigious variety of the language. Basically, when education and social status are linked to a higher or more standard language, many speakers tend to use fewer creole features, like certain structures or vocabulary. This creates a range of language varieties that develop after the creole has been established, and this range is known as the post-creole continuum. The key idea here is that language use isn't static. Instead, it evolves and varies depending on the social context, which is what we call decreolization. This process shows how speakers shift between different forms of the language depending on factors like formality, education, or social prestige. Understanding this continuum helps us see how creole languages are dynamic and closely tied to social identities and power structures within communities. Let's take a closer look at some key concepts here. First, when we talk about code, we're referring to a language that is peculiar to a specific group. It's like a secret language or a specialized jargon that only certain people understand. Now, moving on to code mixing. This happens when lexical items, meaning individual words, are borrowed from one language and then used within sentences of another language. It's a blending, a sort of linguistic mashup that happens quite naturally in bilingual communities. Next, we have code switching. This is a bit more dynamic. It's the practice of changing from one language or dialect to another, often to better suit the situation. For instance, a speaker might switch between languages within a sentence or between sentences to express themselves more effectively or to connect better with their audience. It's important to note that code switching is generally only possible in bilingual or multilingual settings. It reflects how the grammars of both languages are operating simultaneously in a speaker's mind. On the other hand, in code mixing, the grammars of both languages do not work at the same time. They are more intertwined within a sentence, but not functioning simultaneously. So, to sum up, while both phenomena involve switching between languages, code switching involves deliberate shifting to fit context, whereas code mixing involves blending elements from different languages within a sentence without necessarily switching contexts. Both are fascinating ways that languages interact and influence each other in real-life communication, and they highlight the dynamic nature of multilingual language use. All right, let's wrap up with some key concepts about language variation. First, we have slang. Slang is a type of language that consists of very informal words and phrases. It's more common in speech than in writing and tends to be used within specific groups or contexts. An interesting thing about slang is that it often creates new meanings for existing words. For example, words like cool and hot can both mean very good, impressive, or even good-looking, depending on how they're used. Next, we have register. Register refers to the variety of language we use for a particular purpose or in a specific situation. Think of it as choosing the right tone or style depending on who you're talking to or the setting you're in. Finally, there's jargon. Jargon is a set of specialized words that have very specific meanings within a certain field or profession. For instance, the terminology used in science, technology, art, or any trade is considered jargon. All three, slang, register, and jargon, highlight how language adapts to different social and professional contexts. They show us that language isn't static. It evolves and varies depending on who we're talking to and the situation we're in.